In a breakup, you generate the position of someone engaging in the need of retaliation, and thus the use of the deforming or queerification of the target, which otherwise would have facilitated positive emotions and attraction, and thus the action becomes the system of grief, which, if memory serves, is shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, testing, and then acceptance. And thus the action of it starting off with the queerification of the party in order to make the person less and less attractive generates the position of making them whatever you don't like into the thing. And thus you make a list of the things that you want to claim that you don't like, and they become the physical embodiment of that thing. And thus, the action of the person becoming fatter or unsuccessful or balding or whatever the other thing is. And they just write the list and they enforce it and they get the revenge on the picture. Like um like a voodoo doll. And then they, having retaliated against the voodoo doll, generate the entirety of their queer eye onto it, and thus facilitate the physical transforming of the person on from what you liked into what you don't like, and thus the action of the retaliation by the feminism is satisfied, and thus the action of toxic femininity has materialized into its own functioning cult of witches, which then generates the function of toxic femininity, which then materializes into female Gnosticism, which is when they fully engross themselves into the function of their witchcraft. And to this extent, the United States, having been compromised by the intelligence communities, conducting the witchcraft systems, have engaged in the mechanism of the queerification by the witchcraft, by the wizards prohibited by the Bible, in order to engage in the function of their arbitrary fake experiments as a satisfaction of abuse, as its own attraction, without scientific merit or interest into the pursuit of scientific merit, as the position is their own active degrading interests in the injury itself, and thus the action of hurting something makes them feel good, even to the point where they would have bred psychotics who would have attacked their own children with various poisons such as LSD, and thus the action of the person being utterly destroyed simply by the proximity and the interest to the psychopath who has access to the things generates the position of psychopaths as a preferred military function. As who would you rather do? Would you rather corrupt someone who is not psychopathic, or to use psychopaths for the function that you want to do anyways, and thus the action of the creation of the wizards, and thus the indoctrination into the cults, and thus the action has materialized into their abuse structure for the artistic expression of their abuse theaters. And to this extent, you actively have the arbitrary abuses as a interest of its own reoccurring cost, which then they wish to exercise against the general public and against other publics, and thus the action of actively engaging in these abuses against marginalized communities and foreigners, and thus the action of the fake experiments for syphilis, where they actively engage in blocking the medicine and tampering with the evidence of the person so that they would suffer the most as its own express interest even at the point when they have lost functional interest in the cover story, as the abuse is the service, the injury is the service, and thus the mechanism of the queerification transforms itself, and thus the indoctrination and the progress of the female Gnosticisms actively engages in the prostitution of their female Gnostics for the rapists. And thus the queerification then leads into the ratification. And thus the ratification means that the devil goes to the party, the wizard goes to the party, and they actively harass them with the defamation from the voodoo doll, and thus the act of struggling them until they concede and confess to being guilty of being the voodoo doll's definition instead of themselves. And then the application materializes into their systematic being abused in that ratification as they are groomed into place by these ritual harassments. And this includes the subcontracting to outside forces that would bully, harass, and keep them into place. And thus, the action of those bullies are essential to the progress of the very definition of the thing that they claim to be fighting against, making it a permanent state in society, as this is social violence or hate crimes as a mechanism of historically studied science as historic used magic prohibited by the Bible. And this is what Vladimir Putin was referring to when he said that he believed that the West was engaging in the queerification of them and that he needed to reinforce his historic values onto his people, as the queerification from the wizards, who he was not stopping, was actively being conducted against his people, which would have an ebb and flow state, as there would be periods of time when they would do so more, and then there would be times when they would pull back and do so less, and thus the action of it actively having to be conducted in order to materialize the security requires the active state action against the state action according to the hybrid warfare of the queerification of his people, which then collapses them as the racist objective of the white supremacists in the Confederacy infecting the United States, which is the black suits that tell the president how things really run after they go campaigning and tell people everything that they want. The permanent state that Putin is aware of is the Confederacy, as the actual threat is the thing that doesn't go away, as the perpetration of the Cold War, as the function of the parasite of the wizards generates the permanent threat. There is no way for him to deal with it except for the disillusionment of the parasite separate to the host, which requires him to affirm the host. And thus the demoralization structures from historic wizards having been applied in order to destroy the United States and the West without firing a single shot to make them do it to themselves becomes the Cold War threat against him, as the bastard child of communism is fascism, which is the American parasite, and thus the action of the evolution of the Confederate communism of the plantation slavery under national economic capitalism from each plantation to the other generates the position of material communism, and thus the bastardization of the communism is the fascism, which is the fascism that created Hitler, which was funded by bankrupting the American stock market, creating the Great Depression, which then was reinforced by the predetermined war that created the Dust Bowl, which required the Dust Bowl as a mechanism to stress the American people, to force them out of isolation into the conflict which they had created. and thus the action of them actively withdrawing their international trade, removing the resources traded to Japan, triggered Japan into the conflict, as not having the trades actively meant that they had to find it some other way, and this is what militarized Japan. And thus the action of these wizards in the international arrangements from the subtleties by the spy or organizations of the secret societies engaging in the witchcraft for the wizards and the warlocks materializes the infinite threat cycling from these structures, and thus the mechanism ultimately comes into the various stages of grief back into acceptance when you're still doodling on the person's picture, but you're trying to make them attractive again, and thus the fundamental state of having been upset because they were attractive is returned to, and then you go back to base of liking them again. But they're still the devil, and thus the action of making the most attractive version of the adversary then materializes into that function, and that's how you get Twilight. And this includes the function of the mob tactics enforced by James Comey's character, which had actively viewed them as a superior thing in a higher loyalty, and thus the action of his quote unquote higher loyalty materializes, according to the record, into the function of his arbitrary abuses, such as the promotion in the terror factory of the creation of terrorist plots, which then materializes into the queerification process from the witchcraft and their retaliations for the consistent mechanism of the black market, which then allows for the arbitrary retaliations, such as was strategized and practiced in the wars in the Middle East when they actively had locals in the Middle East inform on each other, which then actively turned into superior tactics for economics as the fascists were willing to get rid of their competitors, which increased the market as their ability to produce for the remainder part of the market in the absence of their competition materialized a actual motive for them to engage in the quote unquote narking on their competition, which would always turn out, or historically or normally turn out, to be the average person, benign, not actually guilty of anything person. But since the function is the hyperradicalization, then the position is the murder in question, and thus the action of the person being collected for Guantanamo Bay and others arbitrarily without cause requires the position of not being able to release them, as the function of finding out that they're innocent is worse than them being guilty, as the function of them being innocent means that they didn't have a right to do it in the first place, and there's some assumption of a remedy, and thus the action of them engaging in the quote unquote positive propaganda materializes the activity of them engaging in doing all kinds of good things while actively doing the negative things, which requires the function intellectually of compensating any wrongdoing, and thus the action of them being a neutral to good becomes the overarching estimate until you realize that they don't, and thus the action of it just being a negative, and thus you have a cheap cover story that doesn't really mean anything under dark psychology, which is the least amount of good for the most amount of evil, which is the material presence. And the retaliation against this active, arbitrary, infinite, diverse threat becomes hatred for that group, and thus the action of overgeneralizing an unstudied subject becomes the historic position as the only ones that they have to refer to are a part of the network of the crime, and thus the action of everyone in that becomes the thing, and thus it's like coming into a new game. You don't know what the rules are, you don't know what the cards mean, you don't know what the definitions that you're trading off of, and thus you have to actively use it in order to understand it. And that act of compelled ignorance generates the retaliation in the general, and thus the action of them wanting it to be perceived in the general then materializes it as a thing that misses them, and thus the pendulum, having missed them, materializes the protection of the permanent threat, which, not being countered by the general, which takes offense knowing better, engages in the function, having played the game, knows where the error is and isn't grading it because they want the defect. They want the person to want the negative thing, which is convenient for them. Because if the other person wants it, then the fact that they wanted it first is then nullified, and then they get to pretend a state of morality and outrage at the fact that they tried to do all of those good things, and all they got was negative emotional retaliation. And the arrogance of these people to actively dislike and disfavor and not want their abusers there, that, my friend, that's offensive. And these systems of witchcraft of false outrage generate the retaliation by the refusal of diplomacy, which is actively killed and gutted, as Mattis would have actively sought under that theory to have gutted the diplomats from the United States in order to minimize the capability of the retaliations for legitimate processes, which would have punished the abusers as the abusers doing the injury as its own abuse theater, as its own black market, as its own service for their sadists to enjoy watching the injury as an abuse porn, as a sexual release becomes the active status quo. And then these Schadenfreude type mentalities materializes into such as in Challengers the movie, which then expresses the position of two boys competing over a girl. And thus one of the boys likes the girl, but the other one won the girl. And thus the action of them having had a competition and the one liking him lost and the winner took her, and thus the action of the guy that likes her more makes it more attractive and thus materializes the emotional extortion as the pain and anxiety of the other one increases the sexual tension, increases the satisfaction. It's a great movie, and you should go watch it.